The wind had changed that morning. It blew dry out of the south, dragging the scent of mesquite smoke and scorched earth, turning the sky a silty gray. Miriam Cole stood at the edge of her claim, the hem of her calico dress catching grit like a sail. She held her shawl tight around her shoulders, scanning the horizon where the land folded into low hills, suspicious of what the wind carried in. She was 32 and had outlived a marriage, a stillborn child, and the dry seasons of 2 separate counties. People said she was hard, but the truth was she'd just grown quieter over time. Solitude was easier to manage than the letdown of promises unkept. She kept chickens, tended a patch of hard-bitten crops, and bartered eggs for coffee and salt down in Tuttle Creek when the mule held steady. It wasn't much of a life, but it was hers, and no one could take it unless she let them. She found him lying face down in the red dust an hour before sundown. At first she thought it was a carcass, maybe a deer brought low by coyotes. Then she saw the dark hat half buried near his hand, the boots too fine for any drifter. He was motionless, save for the weak rise and fall of his back. Miriam dismounted with a cautious eye and the rifle still in her hand. She didn't speak right away. She nudged his shoulder with the barrel. He stirred, slow and sluggish, as though rising from a bad dream. When he rolled halfway to his side, she saw blood drying thick along his ribs where his shirt had torn. He blinked blearily up at her, eyes sun-glared and hollow with pain. "You got a name?" she asked, crouching low. His lips moved, but no sound came. She fetched her canteen, poured a little water onto his mouth. He drank like a man nearly drowned, coughing once, then catching her wrist. "Kane," he rasped, "Kane MacLeod." She knew the name. Everyone in the territory did. Kane MacLeod had carved his empire into the Badlands with barbed wire and blood, fencing off thousands of acres, and running more longhorn than any man had a right to. Men envied him. Some hated him. A few tried to kill him. It looked like one of them had come close. Miriam didn't waste breath on questions. She tied his arm across her shoulders, staggered him up, and half-carried him to her mule. He was leaner than she expected, heavy with muscle and a heat that leaked through her cotton sleeves. She bundled him up in the cart behind the saddle and took the long way home, every jostle a new groan from his throat. That night she cleaned his wounds by lamplight, lips pressed tight against the nausea that rose at the sight of torn flesh. She was no nurse, but she tended to dying pigs and birthed colicky colts, and Kane MacLeod didn't seem inclined to quit. He grit his teeth through the stitching, didn't beg, didn't sob. When it was done, he slept hard and fast, breath shallow, as if afraid to take too much from the air. Miriam sat beside him, arms folded, watching the lamp throw their shadows wide across the cabin wall. She should have sent for help, maybe, but she didn't. There was something in the way he held on to consciousness, something raw and unsaid, that made her wary of others getting involved. That, and she'd seen the mark on his neck, a rope burn still red around his throat. Someone hadn't just wanted him gone. They'd wanted him to die afraid. Kane woke again near dawn. She was tending the stove, coffee brewing low, when she heard his voice behind her. "You saved me." She turned. He was propped against the wall, pale and unshaven, but his eyes were clearer now. They studied her not with gratitude, but calculation, like a man measuring the worth of a thing before he spoke. "I couldn't leave you to the buzzards," she said. "Not even you." That surprised a small laugh out of him, though it ended in a cough. "You know who I am." "I know the stories." "Which ones?" She shrugged, sliding the tin cup his way. "The kind folks whisper over poker hands. Land baron, gunman, outlaw turned cattle king, depends who's talking." He drank, eyes never leaving hers. "What do they say about Miriam Cole?" "No one talks about me." "They should." There was a long silence. He set the cup down with care, as though it weighed more than it ought to. "I don't have a home to go back to," he said. "That why they strung you up?" "Maybe." Another silence. "Then stay here," she said, the words catching her off guard even as she spoke them. Kane MacLeod looked around the plain, bare room, the rough-hewn table, the single narrow bed. Then he looked back at her, the woman who had stitched his wounds and sat in the shadows while he slept. "I got nothing to offer you," he said. "Good, I'm not talkin' offers." But she saw it then, just a flicker, how his shoulders sagged with something other than pain. Not relief, not yet, but something like the idea of it. And that was the beginning. Kane spent the first days half-conscious and sweating through fever. Miriam kept to the periphery, changing the bandages in silence, feeding him broth with a steady hand. When he shivered, she laid warm stones at his sides wrapped in rags. When he muttered nonsense in the dark, she sat up by the hearth, listening for scents beneath the murmur. Her body moved by instinct, the way it had when her child had sickened. This time, though, there was no family name to bind her to the task. Just grit, and a promise she hadn't spoken, but had decided all the same. He improved slowly. By the seventh day, Kane could sit up with help, though he grumbled about it like an old bear. The deep wound under his ribs no longer bled, but it wept when he moved too sudden. She stitched a new shirt for him from coarse cotton, her fingers remembering the work they hadn't done in years. "You married?" he asked one afternoon, voice raspier than it used to be. She didn't answer right off. She was breaking beans into a pot, sleeves rolled high, the windows thrown open to let the wind chase the smell of sickness from the air. She said finally. Buried him 5 winters back after the fever took hold of half the county. He went quicker than most. Kane nodded once, watching the steam rise from the pot. "You?" "No." She raised an eyebrow. "Never." "I tried once, didn't take." She had finer ambitions. Miriam set the pot on the stove and wiped her hands. Kane MacLeod, undone by a woman with dreams. He smiled, slow and rueful. She said I'd never be more than dirt in a better man's boots. "Were you?" He didn't answer, just stared into the fire until the shadows climbed his cheek. By late spring, Kane was strong enough to walk the property. He moved with a limp now, though he never named its cause. Miriam let him roam, let him see the fields grown fallow and the shed roof curling at the edges. He asked few questions but watched everything. "You could run 10 times the stock you do," he said one morning, standing in the orchard where only 2 apple trees still bore fruit. "So why don't you?" "Because I don't have the hands, or the patience to wrangle cowboys." He gave a dry laugh. "No, I don't suppose you do." That evening, she found him hammering boards across the broken barn door. He worked slow but sure, like the act of building something helped hold him upright. "You fixin' to pay rent?" she asked, leaning in the doorway. He didn't look up. "Figured I owed you at least a latch that shuts." "You owe me nothin'." Kane straightened, sweat shining across his throat. "I was strung up on my own land, Miriam, left to rot like a rustler. You think I can just go back to that?" She studied him a long moment. There was a hollow under his cheekbone that hadn't been there before, the kind of mark loss leaves behind. "You don't have to go back," she said low. Kane didn't answer, but that night he stayed up sharpening fence posts by the firelight. Word came through in late May that the MacLeod holdings had been seized by a syndicate out of Abilene. Some said it was legal, others whispered betrayal from inside. His foreman, it was said, now wore Kane's signet and sat at his desk, claiming the cattle and deeds both. Men like Kane didn't vanish without wolves moving in. Miriam brought him the letter, unsigned but clearly meant for him, postmarked 2 weeks earlier. Kane read it without a twitch in his jaw. "So they've already buried me," he said softly. "Then maybe it's time you start something new." He folded the letter with care and slid it into the stove without a glance back. "I built an empire and bled for it. Now I got less than a man with a shovel and no land." "You got land here." He looked at her then, not startled but searching, like her words held some puzzle he hadn't thought to solve. "You offering. I'm not in the business of charity." "No, you're not." She met his gaze steady. "But I'm tired, Kane, and I've run this place alone long enough. A man who's lost everything has nothing left to lie about. I trust that." He turned back toward the door, and for a while the only sound was the prairie wind. "This land yours by deed?" he asked at last. "It is." He nodded. "Then I'll work it, if you'll have me." And just like that, the air between them shifted. Not soft, not warm, but settled like dust choosing a place to land. June came with heat that cracked the dirt in long spidered lines, and the hens began laying less under the strain of it. Miriam tied a wet rag beneath her bonnet to keep from fainting in the fields, and Kane began rising before first light, his silhouette etched dark against the haze as he repaired the corral or walked the fence line. The limp never eased, but he didn't speak of it. Neither did she. They worked side by side with the kind of rhythm that doesn't come from talking, only time. She taught him which rows to water by hand and which could be left to the mercy of the sky. He showed her how to check hooves for stone bruises and taught her to use the branding iron with a cleaner touch. Some evenings they sat on the stoop with coffee gone cold between them, listening to the night insects hum. She watched how he held himself in the quiet, chin tucked low, hands still, as though he didn't trust what might rise in him if he spoke too much. Once, when a coyote cried sharp and sudden from the hills, he flinched like it meant something different to him than it did to her. One morning, she caught him staring out at the eastern ridge, with a look that didn't match the rest of him. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "There's a spring over that way, used to belong to an old rancher named Lyle, before he was bought out." "I know it, he died 2 winters ago, no kin." Kane nodded. "There's water enough there to make the land good again, if a man were to reclaim it." "You mean steal it back?" "I mean remind the land who tended it first." Miriam said nothing. There was steel in his voice, but it was tempered now, less fury, more weight. She didn't know if she liked that better. That night Kane returned late from Tuttle Creek, a box of nails under one arm, his face darker than usual. She noticed it first in his silence, in the stiffness of his walk. Then she saw the torn corner of his shirt, the blood welling anew at the edge of his old wound. "You went lookin' for trouble," she said, wetting a rag. "Didn't have to look far," he muttered. "Men there speak my name like it's ash." He sat while she cleaned the wound. Neither spoke until she pressed the cloth deeper than she meant to, and he flinched. "You think I'm just gonna watch them take what's mine," he said. "It ain't yours anymore, Kane. You said it yourself. Let it lie." He turned to her then, something raw in his eyes. "That land fed 100 families. I didn't just run cattle. I built a world out of nothing." "And now you have to build another," she said low. His jaw worked against that truth. Later, when the cabin had gone still and the fire had died to coals, Miriam lay awake listening to his breathing on the cot across the room. She could feel the air between them thick with things neither had said. There was no promise here, not yet. Just a long stretch of hard days and the question of whether two people could build something that wouldn't break. Next morning, Kane didn't rise with the sun. Miriam found him kneeling in the field beside the old well, eyes closed, his hands buried in the soil like he was praying. Not to a god, but to the ground itself. Autumn crept in like a secret, slow and golden, curling at the edges of things. The cottonwoods turned first, leaves trembling like coins on the wind. The mornings grew sharper, breath turning visible before the sun fully climbed. Kane's limp worsened in the cold, but he said less and worked more. Miriam noticed he favored his right leg now, and that sometimes his fingers shook when he buttoned his coat, but she kept her eyes on the chores and her questions to herself. He had claimed the broken paddock as his project, digging new posts by hand, shaping a space fit for horses neither of them yet owned. Miriam watched the corral rise day by day, not with urgency but purpose, as though Kane wasn't rebuilding a fence but something in himself. They began taking meals together, a quiet evolution from necessity to routine. She noticed how he waited for her to sit, how he passed the salt without being asked. He didn't fill silences, but he didn't run from them either. Sometimes they'd sit by the stove long after supper, the light low, his voice finally unspooling stories she hadn't asked for. He told her about his father's death in the drought of '61, about the first head of cattle he bought with borrowed money and a forged signature. He spoke of fire and men with guns and the blood cost of fences in open country. "It wasn't all right," he said once, his gaze fixed on the hearth. "But I thought if I made it big enough, loud enough, I could drown out what I'd done to get there." "And did you?" Miriam asked. He looked at her, tired, not even close. She didn't offer absolution, just poured him another measure of coffee and handed it across the table. The offer came in early October. A writer from Abilene, dressed in oilskin and arrogance, bearing papers with sharp signatures and legal threats tucked into velvet tones. Kane stood at Miriam's side as the man read them aloud, something about disputed claims, outstanding debts, forgotten oaths. The writer never looked at her directly, not until Kane stepped forward and took the envelope, unflinching. "You tell them," Kane said, voice cold as creekstone, "that Kane MacLeod is dead. This land don't belong to him anymore." Miriam watched the rider's face shift then, confusion flickering under the smugness. "This land belongs to Miriam Cole," Kane finished, "and she don't scare easy." After the man had gone, Miriam stood with her arms crossed, watching dust settle where hooves had stirred it. "You meant that?" she asked quietly. Kane nodded once. "I did." He didn't look at her when he said it, maybe because he knew the weight of such words, maybe because he was afraid to see what they meant reflected in her eyes. Later that week, Miriam found him in the orchard, pacing the rows where new saplings had taken root. She noticed him going there more often, walking the line between past and promise. "I've been thinking," he said without turning. "If we dam the creek just north of here, we could flood that dry patch west of the ridge, get another field growing come spring." She stepped beside him. "We." Kane smiled, a rare, slow thing. "I've made more enemies than friends, Miriam, but if I've learned anything, it's that the land don't care who you were, only what you give back." The wind moved through the trees, stirring leaves like whispers. Miriam nodded. "Then let's give it something worth remembering." And he reached for the shovel. The dam took 2 weeks to raise. They worked from dawn until the sun was a smear behind the hills, stacking stone and timber across the narrow bend where the creek turned shallow. Miriam's arms ached each night, muscles burning in places long dormant. Kane's hands blistered, and the old wound at his ribs flared again, but neither of them spoke of it. By mid-month, the water pooled wide behind the makeshift barrier, slow and glassy. It filled the long-starved trench Kane had carved through the ridge's edge, trickling toward the field that hadn't grown anything but weeds in 3 years. Miriam stood at the edge of it one evening, her boots sunk in the wet earth. Kane joined her, both of them quiet as the first reflection of stars blinked in the surface. "Never thought I'd see this land green again," she said. Kane didn't answer right away. He was looking not at the water but at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "I thought I'd be buried with a gun in my hand and spite in my mouth," he said. "Never thought I'd be here, not like this." She didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she watched a dragonfly hover above the new water, wings flickering silver. "You're not the only one," she murmured. That night the first frost settled soft across the fields, and she laid a second quilt on Kane's cot without a word. He'd moved out to the barn 3 weeks back, said he wanted to give her space, but she'd seen how he lingered at the cabin door most nights before turning away. Winter settled over them like a quiet held too long. Days grew shorter. The mule grew slower. Miriam mended clothes by firelight and counted the stores, while Kane drew plans in the dirt for fences yet to be built. It was a season of small rituals. Coffee left steaming on the stoop before sunrise, boots cleaned and set beside one another in the entryway, wood chopped and stacked without needing to ask. One morning, after a night of cold wind and restless sleep, Miriam woke to find the orchard covered in frost glass. She stepped outside and found Kane already there, hat low, hands in his coat pockets, looking out over the fields. "I had a dream," he said without turning. "Bad ones." "No, not this time. I was building a porch, big, wide thing, room for rocking chairs and muddy boots. You were there, laughing at me for getting the angles wrong." She stepped beside him, the air sharp in her lungs. "Funny dream," she said. He turned to her then, slower now, with none of the swagger he once wore like a second skin. "It wasn't about power, Miriam, not cattle or land or my damn name. It was just peace, just that porch." They stood there for a long time. The frost began to melt at the edges, sunlight catching on the pale bark of the apple trees. Later that day, Miriam found the deed in the drawer by the stove, her name on the line. Kane scrawled below in rough ink, barely legible, but there. He hadn't told her, hadn't made a speech or asked for thanks. Just given her the land in full. She closed the drawer without touching it, then went outside, where Kane was cutting wood, sleeves rolled, sweat on his brow despite the cold. "You think this changes anything?" she asked, voice low. "No," he said, "but maybe it makes things right." She stepped forward, took the axe from his hand, and planted it firm in the chopping block. "Nothing's ever been made right without both hands on it," she said, "and I'm not building a future alone." He looked at her, that same searching look he'd given her in the dust the day they met. "No," he said, "you're not." Spring came quiet that year, not in a burst of bloom, but in a slow, deliberate thaw. The last of the snowmelt sank deep into the fields they'd sown late with rye and clover, and the creek behind the dam ran clear enough to see stone minnows darting beneath its skin. Miriam marked the days by the weight of the morning light and the scent of damp earth rising through the floorboards. She didn't speak of the ache in her knees or the soft fear that stirred whenever something felt too easy. She only kept planting, kept walking beside him. Cain had taken to wearing his hat less indoors. His hair was going silver at the temples, and the scar across his side pulled tighter when he turned. Still, he moved better now. There was steadiness in him, not swagger or threat, but gravity, the kind that stays even after the storms passed. They spent long days mending the east pasture fence, hands moving in tandem without much need for words. Sometimes he'd hum as he worked, low and tuneless, and she'd glance over and catch him watching her, not with want but with wonder, like he still couldn't believe he'd found shelter in her shadow. It was late May when the colt came. The mare had been restless for a day and a half, and they'd taken turns staying up, checking on her in the strawlit dark of the barn. When the foal finally slid free, all legs and tremble, Miriam knelt in the hay and wiped its nostrils clear while Cain steadied the mother's flank. The colt was black as coal, with a white blaze down its nose, one of those blessings you don't ask for, just accept. "You ever name a horse before?" Cain asked, crouching beside her. "No," Miriam said, brushing straw from her skirts, "but I think this one's called Mercy." Cain let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Mercy," he repeated, like it was a word he hadn't used in years. That night they didn't go back to separate beds. They sat by the fire in silence, the colt's birth still hanging around them like smoke. Miriam felt his hand brush hers, tentative. She didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her palm upward and closed her fingers around his. No words were needed. Later in the dark, with the door open to let the warm night in, she listened to his breathing and knew it was not just survival that had brought them here, but choice. Day after day, gesture after quiet gesture. The porch Cain had dreamed of got built plank by plank. He measured it twice and cut each board with care, cursing the angles under his breath, just like in his dream. Miriam painted it pale blue. They added a bench, then 2 chairs, then a table small enough to set coffee on but big enough to share. In the evenings, they sat there, watching dusk settle on the fields they turned green again. Sometimes they talked, sometimes not. It didn't matter. One afternoon, a boy from town rode up with a parcel and a note addressed to Miriam. Cain stood back while she opened it. Inside was a worn leather ledger, the MacLeod brand burned into the corner. "It's the last of it," Cain said when she looked at him. "The accounts, the contracts, the names I thought would carry on without me." Miriam leafed through it, then closed the book and set it on the windowsill, the firelight catching its edge. "Let the past rest, Cain." He nodded. "I already did. I gave it to you." "No," she said. "You gave me your truth. This," she touched the porch rail, the dirt beneath their boots, the sky growing wide above them. "This we built together." In the end, it wasn't the land he offered her that changed things. It was the way he stayed. Each day, every day. By the time the colt was full grown, folks in Tuttle Creek had stopped asking after Cain MacLeod. They talked instead of the coal place, how the pastures ran strong again, how the woman who lived there had brought the land back from the brink. They never said what she'd lost, only what she'd made. But she remembered. And every night when she laid her head down beside the man who'd once been left for dead, Miriam Cole knew the truth of legacy. Not a name carved in stone, but the quiet miracle of being seen, chosen, and loved in return.